Anyway, well, thank you for having me here this afternoon. And, just to reiterate, and it's really nice of you to say that, but it's probably out of proportion. The people on the Western Slope staff, Tara, Camille, Kirsten, Jeff, Craig, who for some weird reason isn't presenting today, Stephanie, who am I forgetting? Alan. Bob, we love Bob. He's not on our staff, but we love Bob anyway. I know there's somebody else. Whatever. Anyway, I told somebody at lunch I'm not aging very gracefully. Yeah, these guys are really super good. They're an amazing staff. They come out to your communities all up and down the West Slope. And not only do they do projects, but they pour themselves into these projects. And since we're talking uranium, Jeff and Camille have shouldered the bulk of the burden of taking care of the uranium problems here in the West End areas. Jeff has probably closed, I'm guessing, hundreds of uranium mines over the last 3 or 4 years. And Camille's taken a leadership role in doing a lot of the environmental remediation work. We haven't done a whole lot of projects, but we've launched a couple of them that she's completed down in the Urban area, and we're on the very cusp of beginning another really cool project. I don't know where Camille went, but I can't remember if it's is it San Miguel County or Dolores? Or neither in San Miguel. So anyway, thank you. You guys are awesome staff. Anyway, so you already know who I am. And obviously I'm with the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety Inactive Mines Program. So the staff's responsibilities are, for the most part, to go to identify mine sites with specific issues. So we go to these inactive mines, staff identifies hazards and site issues, defines what those are, and then designs solutions for those problems, be it earthwork or be it closing abandoned mines for public health and safety reasons. And then they construct those solutions using third-party contractors. So I use construction and reclamation pretty interchangeably. Pretty much what I'm talking, I probably use 3 or 4 other words too. Whenever it sounds like an action verb, it really means that in this instance, we're closing abandoned mine sites or open mine sites. Our staff's on site before reclamation, during reclamation, and periodically monitors the closures post-reclamation. Some of the work, the bulk of the work, probably 90% of the work, is on the surface outside of a mine. Some amount of work needs to occur under the brow. So in this open mine here, under the brow simply means that they're just barely inside the opening. So you can see these supports. Like Jeff would probably be just inside here making measurements of dimensions and making radiation measurements as well. And just so a pre and post closure, here's an open hole, and here's the same hole post closure with a bat-friendly grate on it. Starting to get ahead of myself already. So, we're obviously talking about uranium health and safety, and our uranium work occurs in the Uraban mineral belt. And just, obviously for reference, we're here in Telluride, the mineral belt's out on the border, here in western Mesa County, Montrose County, San Miguel, and a portion of Dolores counties. So, we've identified there's 2 radiation hazards that we most frequently encounter and that we're most concerned about. Those are gamma and radon related. Another word for radon, actually, the more proper terminology should have been gamma and alpha radiation. So gamma presents itself as a wave. It's a wave of radiation. It has high penetration powers. You can shield yourself from gamma by hiding behind concrete or lead. And the biologic hazard to individuals is a whole body exposure. So if you're exposed to significant amounts of gamma radiation, your tissues are vulnerable to attack by the gamma. Alpha, on the other hand, is a particulate versus a wave sort of transmission. Has very low penetration powers. It disperses quickly in the atmosphere, whereas gamma will travel through the atmosphere without problem. Alpha can be shielded by your skin, by clothing, by paper. It's just not very powerful. And yet the biologic hazard is internal, mainly through inhalation, and we'll get into that in just a moment, actually. So hopefully nobody came here just to hear numbers, because, my famous quote is, I don't do math. I was going to do a paper. I know, right? I'm a geologist because they said there's no math involved. And they were wrong. Anyway, so I was going to do actually a whole paper on figuring out units of measurement. And not only was it like exceedingly boring, but this is much more on point. But you need to understand that when you look at measurement of radiation, there's all kinds of different units, many, many different units. And it can be quite confusing. And the takeaway from this slide here is that there's various units of measurements for different kinds of measurements. So there's units for strength of a radioactive source. There's units of measurement for the energy of radiation, for the level of radiation in the environment, and dose is the amount of radiation absorbed by the body. If you want to know more about units and how those are derived, and there's a new changing nomenclature that's sort of happening internationally, this is a great site, the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety Radiation Fact Sheet on the internet. In about 12 pages, it lays it all out for you, way better than I could ever do, and it is very comprehensible. The important things that we want to talk about and kind of get a handle on are these two terms, working level and working level months. So working level is a measure of the concentration of radon progeny in a unit volume of air. Back in the day, you remember people always talk about radon daughters? So that's out. Radon progeny is the correct term now. And what that, I know, but what that means though is that radon is a relatively unstable atom. And because it wants to be stable, everybody knows nature abhors a void, is shedding off electrons and is trying to become a more stable particle. So those things that are being shed off turn out to be the daughters or progeny. That progeny is in the atmosphere, and it's basically what you would suck in when you're working in an underground mining situation. So working level, volume of concentration of radon progeny in a unit volume of air, usually a cubic meter. A working level month describes the exposure of a person to one working level of radon progeny in 170 hours. 170 more or less is the national average, describes how many hours you would work in any environment in a work month. That make sense? So basically what we're looking at is working level and working level months. Working level months essentially are telling us the exposure to radon progeny per unit time. So all our health considerations and all our safety considerations in an underground mining situation pertaining to alpha, or radon, are measured in working level months. So, quick background, what are the sources of radiation at these mines? Well, gamma is a byproduct or a product of the actual materials mined. So carnotite, uraninite, vanadium, all emit gamma radiation. Where do you find that stuff? Well, you can find it at the abandoned mines, either as ore left on site because it was sub-economic in the day that it was mined, or an ore cart spilled, and that residual ore is still left on the ground. You can find it in the waste of overburden from surface uranium mines, and you can find it in the waste rock that's kind of spilled out on the ground in front of underground mines. Radon, on the other hand, is emitting from the mine entry itself. So the formation that was mined is emitting this particulate radiation in the form of radon, and that material is moving out of the mine by virtue of the convection currents that are set up in these underground mining systems. So a mine that exhales is called an exhaling mine. A mine that intakes is an inhaling mine. The critical stuff to know when you're doing this sort of work, whether a mine's inhaling or exhaling. So, as Camille pointed out this morning, we wanted to talk sort of about the evolution of reclamation. So we started reclamation mining, or whatever we called back in the day, my organization, back in the early 80s, started doing uranium reclamation work. And at that time, we didn't have a big handle on what the health safety issues may be radiation-wise. So what we were interested in doing at that time was monitoring gamma. So a guy, Paul Kraybacker, some of you might remember Paul would go to these sites and he'd have a scintillometer and he'd run out and he'd figure out how much gamma is being emitted and he'd write that down. And he'd calculate how much time he was on site. And then he would be able to figure out his gamma exposure. But we didn't pay any attention to alpha at all. We didn't pay attention to radon. Since that time, our thinking is evolving quite a bit to where now we're realizing gamma is not that big a deal for the kind of work we're doing. What is a big deal is the alpha or radon radiation that we're encountering. So anyway, so Paul was out there doing his scintillometer counts, and we did some work in the early 80s. The work in uranium country tapered off significantly for a lot of different reasons through the 90s and into the early 2000s. And then in the early 2000s, our funding situation changed. After a while, Jeff came on board, and we started doing more and more reclamation work at these abandoned mines. At that time, we started recognizing the hazards that alpha presents versus gamma. So what we decided to do is, nobody should ever go to work and come home sick, right? I mean, just as a general rule. So that's one thing I was really concerned about. There's no staff, no contractor that works for us is going to get sick as a result of going to work. So we put together alpha radiation-centered health and safety guidelines that established certain exposure limitations and were dependent on wearing personal protective equipment, PPE equipment, in order to shield us from that alpha radiation. So that was sort of interesting, and it probably worked somewhat. We had numeric standards, we had personal protection equipment, and as an aside note, we were doing a lot of work for BLM. BLM, was rightly concerned and decided that they wanted to have the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health look at the implementation of these guidelines and make some calls on whether those were good, bad, or indifferent. And what they discovered was that we're actually doing a pretty good job. They wanted to tweak our exposure numbers a little bit, but most significantly, they wanted us to tweak how we approach PPE. And their thing was, let's not resort to personal protective equipment. Let's resort to cultural practices that would eliminate the need to be in the environment before you start donning PPE. Anyway, so go ahead. The BLM is now looking at taking our standards and nationalizing those. So we're pretty happy that we think we're definitely on target. Very briefly, the takeaway from this is that the radon progeny has an affinity for dust. And that dust in an exhaling mine is potentially carrying radon progeny. You suck that into your lungs and you got a source in your body. So that's what we want to avoid. So how do we do that? First, we acknowledge that there is in fact a radiation hazard that we need to deal with. Second thing is we need to keep in perspective that degree of hazard in relationship to the other hazards presented by these mines. So if your job is to be under this and try to close that without killing yourself, A, you're very brave, and B, you got to be very careful. If you're wearing a whole body exclosure suit and you have a breathing tank on your back and you only have limited vision because you have a face shield on and you back into this, you're probably going to have a mine on your head. Is the radiation big? Yeah, I mean, yeah. Is that mine falling on your head really a big deal? Absolutely. So what we do in order to take all that stuff into consideration is we adopted this ALARA concept. So we wanted to keep our exposures as low as reasonably achievable in the context of all the other hazards we deal with at those sites. So what that meant for us is that we want to take appropriate precautions to ensure no one leaves a work site and becomes sick as a result of doing our work. And to that end, we developed very specific health and safety protocols that will meet those requirements, given the time we spend on site. We have these protocols established internally. We have them established in contracts. And what we require is that our contractors pull those health and safety specifications into their contracts. So it's a meaningful portion of their contract, and that they're being implemented in the way we meant them to be implemented. The alpha and gamma measurements that we make on the site drive the implementation of various cultural practices and the use of PPE. And basically we're relying, we're relying on these numbers. We've decided through a ton of calculations that we can live with having a radonic progeny exposure not exceeding 1.55 working level months per year. That makes certain assumptions that contractors will not be on site for over 1,000 hours, and that my staff won't be on site for over 800 miles. Thank you. Moving on. Gamma, on the other hand, 2 rem per year maximum exposure, and to understand how those exposures happen, we are taking gamma measurements and recording times on site. And we do require personal dosimetry, which is a gamma measurement for people on site, and then they record their time to make the calculations. For radon, we use this machine and a similar one frequently. It's called a Sabre Alert 2. It's a moderately rugged machine that gives a real-time radon progeny measurement in milli working levels. Simple conversion to get to working levels to see where you're at. Since it's real time, we can monitor people's exposure when they're under the brow working. The highest recorded measurement dictates what sort of activities will occur at the site. And one of the important things that we want to look at when we're taking into account the radon concentrations and the measurements of working levels at the work site is understanding weather observations, because barometric pressure has a huge impact on how much the mine ventilates, either inhales or exhales. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a whole science as far as that goes. But the ventilation patterns in the mine will very much dictate how much radon is being emitted at any one point in time. The big takeaway there is, because it's emitting X number of cubic feet per minute of air, might be different this afternoon, might be different tomorrow. Definitely different in the spring than in the summer than in the fall. So it's a constant task to monitor the radon to understand where you are at any one point in time. So here's what we decided to do. We have no controls and no PPE requirement below 0.09 working levels. From 0.1 to 2.45, we implement cultural practices and start to don PPE. From 2.46 to 5.01, we require some ventilation to occur at the work area, as well as cultural practices and PPE. So you see it's sort of an escalating scale of things. Then at 5.02 working levels, only people with a self-contained breathing apparatus are allowed to be at the work site. Totally impractical. So that means, in practical terms, 5.2 is a work stop. And I think we've only run into that once or twice, maybe just once, where we had to stop work and wait for a better day, month, year.
What do you mean by cultural control?
Well, let's just talk about that. Here we go. Oh, sorry. I got a whole slide. I thought it was next. Anyway, just so for reference purposes, Mine Safety and Health Administration regulates active underground mining. They require half-face respirators at one working level. We're at 0.09. And they ventilate at 5. And then, if you hit that again, please. NIOSH, so this is less restrictive than we are. This is more restrictive. We're at 0.09, they're at 0.08 at NIOSH. However, our calculations are for 1,000 hours maximum on site, and theirs are for 2,000. So if you did the math, we're actually quite a bit more protective even than NIOSH. So cultural practices. The cultural practices, and that was a great question, include understanding and reacting to the natural ventilation patterns, suppressing dust at the work site, constructing Brattis or other form-fit devices to keep the atmosphere in the mine, and then using mechanical means, so being in a machine so you're not in the radon stream. Just a couple of quick photos. These guys are building a footer inside of a mine. There'll be a grate or a bulkhead built here. Just very simple. We're just watering, it's obviously hand and shovel work. The guy's just keeping the work site wet to keep any dust down. So then the radon progeny can't latch onto the dust. Barricades, not a great success story, but the concept is there. This is just a piece of cloth that we put up against the face of an exhaling mine and measured the difference in radon production before and after. It sort of works, it sort of doesn't. There's a lot of different alternatives to this, but it gives you an idea that you can sort of stop the extreme flow of radon into the work area by taking a pretty simple measure. And this is probably the most important thing. It's sort of light in this room, but I think maybe you can see an entry here and an entry here. So this is where you need to have a critical eye, and you need to have the experience of our project managers. If, for instance, and it's not uncommon to see this whole inhale and this whole exhale, for instance. So our project managers need to be on site, understand that dynamic relationship. So you would want to preferentially close these to minimize the exhale down low. So to do that, perhaps you'd build an airtight bulkhead up on the top one. So if that can no longer inhale, likely you're reducing, if not eliminating, the exhale down here. So that now creates that from maybe a hazardous situation to a much safer situation because you don't have that exhaling atmosphere to work in any longer. And again, the final solution is just to work away from the mine site. As I mentioned earlier, radon disperses quickly in atmosphere. So this guy is a stick away, what's that, 15, 20 feet away from a backfill. He's totally in the clear. You could have a radon monitoring instrument in that cab and he's ambient. Gamma is sort of simpler. As I mentioned, the gamma that we've measured all through the uranium mineral belt, with one exception in Utah, we've been way low. I just can't get excited about gamma. And we look at our yearly totals and our time on site, we're well below our 2 rem limitations. But we're still cautious. We try to put people in cabs with positive ventilation. We try to utilize as much water as we can to keep dust down. And again, we're just mostly rely on monitoring and time on site. So if everyone has a personal dosimeter that's reading your gamma intake exposure, you can make calls on whether it's time to move somebody out of a work area or whether the work area is safe or not. Plus, the project managers have scintillometers on site to measure the actual exposures. So, in summary, our program's evolved a lot over the years. We went from simple gamma monitoring, thinking we were safe, realizing we were unsafe, figuring out what the problem actually was, taking some steps to alleviate that problem, realizing that we didn't take exactly the appropriate steps, and then with the help of NIOSH, sort of dial those things in. We have bought completely and totally into the ALARA principle. We continue to make a lot of monitoring and measurements for individuals on individual sites. Although we think gamma is not a big deal, we continually monitor ourselves to make sure we never surpass that 2 rem per year. What else is pertinent here? Making gamma or alpha measurements before and during construction is critical, so we always know what the contractor's work environment looks like. Ensuring that we use the cultural and environment or engineering practices in order to keep the workplace safe. Using PPE, but only as a second resort and only when necessary in order to avoid making a hazardous situation even more so. And finally, just always keeping in mind that time, distance, exposure are the 3 ways to interrupt that radiation pathway. I think that's it. Do you have questions in the remaining minute or 2? Yes?
Do you just do closures on public land or you do on private land?
Private and public. We do mostly BLM managed lands, but we do our private properties as well. Yes?
Steve, where's your funding come from to do this closure?
These come, that's a great question. We use 3 different sources, primarily using Bureau of Land Management. We have a cooperative agreement with BLM. So they fund maybe 60% of any one closure. We use state severance tax monies for the remainder and some Office of Surface Mining money that actually Kirsten discussed earlier. Yes?
With the radon progeny's affinity for dust, is it very transferable?
How do you mean
in dust storms, when you get like the blowing dust storms and stuff in the area?
My guess, I don't know the exact answer to that. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably not because of the atmospheric dispersion that'll happen at that point. When you're at an entry, you can measure, let's just say 1 working level right here. You can stand back 15 feet and be 10, 15 times less than that. So I would guess that the dust would also disperse, the wind would disperse that, such that you probably would not have the same issue. Yes?
How are you addressing waste rock piles, contaminated soil, or it seems like the photographs is really closing up or block or putting breaks on the openings, so, and what are any actual remediation, vegetation?
Yeah, that's a great question, thanks. We are primarily funded to do the safety closures. Periodically, we have remediation money. Camille's done some remedial work in the Yerevan area. By remediations, I mean earthwork. You're recreating a landform of some sort. So in those few instances where we do have money, and we have an opportunity coming up very shortly at the Centennial and Sun Cup mines, very on the far west end, we will do surveys to understand what the background radiation is, what those sources are, and then depending on what the numbers are, well obviously we'll take some sort of mitigative steps to either encapsulate, isolate, disperse, whatever the right solution is given the numbers we see on site. But we just don't have a whole lot of money available to us much to my dismay, actually, to do the environmental remediation work. I wish we did, because I would really like to see this program moving in that direction in uranium country.
That question's a great transition to our next
Okay.
speaker as well.
Thank you
We'll
very
take
much.
One more. Are you okay? Okay.